Welcome to Manhwa Verse. Spoilers ahead. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more interesting recaps videos. The manhwa opened with the image of a vast sky, where a massive creature, a wyvern, circled freely. A man reflected that on that day he had seen nothing freer than that wyvern. At that moment, as a worker of the great magical house Declan, he decided to retire as a troubleshooter. For him, that freedom in the sky symbolized true free will. The scene shifted. Under ominous cries of a bird, the same man admitted that now he was the last one left. A figure was shown being force-choked beneath cloudy skies. The victim remarked that protagonist had clearly been hiding his true skills, as such power was far beyond that of an ordinary troubleshooter. But protagonist dismissed him, saying he would be the one asking the questions. Pulling out a book, he asked whether it was a magic tome. The victim confirmed, though he mockingly requested that protagonist tighten his grip. He then pointed out that they had not gathered merely to defeat a single hunting dog, implying a greater mission. Protagonist retorted that if it involved trash like House Declan, then a whole pack would surely appear. He pressed further, asking how to use the tome. The victim admitted he didn't know. Protagonist then observed that even the greedy Declan family hadn't managed to unlock its use, yet they had chased him this far. Proof of its value. The victim demanded the tome's return, promising to ask the family head to show mercy and even allow protagonist to resume life as a troubleshooter. But protagonist only smiled and asked why he would ever go back to such a miserable job. When asked for final words, the victim tried to curse him, but protagonist mockingly praised his bravery. At that moment, another man slowly approached, sending chills down protagonist's spine. He immediately sensed danger. The newcomer acknowledged his sharp instincts and introduced himself. Farron von Declan, head of the powerful magical house Declan, one of the greatest families on the eastern continent. Realizing the severity of the situation, protagonist recognized the aura, vicious and overwhelming, and noted that there could only be one such presence. He recalled that in more than a decade as a troubleshooter, spending half his life with them, this was his first time seeing the family head in person. Farron requested that he hand over the tome, promising they could talk afterward. Protagonist, however, complained that this was nothing but shameless robbery. Farron, rather than being offended, burst into laughter, which protagonist matched with his own derisive grin. Protagonist reflected that perhaps he should never have seen that wyvern, since his path had led him here, to face the most formidable mage he had ever encountered. Farron stated that it would be easier to simply kill him and reclaim the tome, but instead he offered an alternative. If protagonist returned to House Declan's fold and handed over the tome, all his past actions would be overlooked. He praised protagonist's talent, saying that even though he was a filthy stray from the gray zone who had mastered only low-level troubleshooter techniques, he had displayed them at an extraordinary level. With House Declan as his wings, Farron promised, he could soar high. But protagonist paid little attention. His gaze drifted back to the sky, where a bird flew, reminding him once again of the wyvern and the freedom it symbolized. At last, he agreed to return the tome, but with one condition. He demanded the head seat itself. Farron barely contained his anger. Protagonist taunted him further, claiming that surely Farron had been watching the earlier battle and could count the number of deaths himself. As he spoke, he finally snapped the neck of the man he had been holding in the air all along, ending him. Farron grew angry, remarking that if things continued this way, there was a strong chance the protagonist would die. The protagonist admitted that Farron was not wrong, yet he charged forward regardless, saying he was far too committed to worry about the consequences anymore. As their auras collided violently, he added that he could not know what was longer or shorter until he measured it. Farron responded coldly, claiming that it seemed necessary to put him in his place. Stretching out his hand, he conjured a magic circle that summoned an earthen spear beneath the protagonist. A second spear instantly appeared in front of him, forcing the protagonist to realize the danger of the rapid follow-up. He narrowly evaded to the side, remarking that this level of precision reflected the skill of a head of a prestigious family. To him, it felt as though there was no opening in Farron's defense. Farron asked mockingly if he had lost himself in thought. In that instant, the protagonist crashed into a magical barrier, caught completely off guard. Farron laughed, pointing out that while the protagonist had said one could not know until measuring, there were also things that required no measuring to understand. When the protagonist placed his hand against the barrier and looked up, he saw a massive magic circle overhead. Farron told him that the size of that circle reflected the vast gap between them. The protagonist could do nothing but watch helplessly as the attack descended. Once the dust settled, Farron explained that he only roughed him up and asked if he was finally ready to talk. The protagonist, staggering but defiant, asked if bowing his head and agreeing to live as Farron's shadow would spare his life. Farron questioned whether he was truly expected to believe that. The protagonist, however, began preparing a counterattack, declaring that he would never submit. He raised his hand and summoned a weapon resembling a spirit gun, channeling a massive burst of energy. Proclaiming that he was finished being their dog, he unleashed a devastating beam at the family head. The attack, however, was blocked with ease. The protagonist demanded to know why he would ever return to servitude, arguing that a shiny leash and a grand house still amounted to nothing more than a kennel. Farron dismissed him as pathetic. Raising his cane, he tapped it against the ground. A small circle appeared beneath the protagonist, which then expanded outward until it encompassed the entire area. Farron declared that he wished to show him overwhelming power, so that he would regret his final moments. The protagonist admitted that he had expected things to unfold this way ever since encountering Farron. As lightning coursed across the sky, he reflected that this was why he had once looked upward at a wyvern soaring freely above, because of House Declan itself. When he returned to awareness, Farron remarked that it was impressive he had survived, confessing that he had truly expected him to die. He asked whether the protagonist now felt the difference in their strength. Barely standing, the protagonist acknowledged Farron's power. Farron pressed him further, asking if he was ready to talk or if he still had words left unsaid. The protagonist asked if what Farron wanted was for him to become a troubleshooter again. Farron clarified that he had no such intention. Instead, he wished for him to take the role of head of the Bongshin family. The protagonist, stunned, asked if House Declan truly wanted him to swear loyalty as a vassal family, despite being strong enough to challenge the throne. He concluded that this must have been their goal from the start. Farron insisted that he was underestimating his own worth, declaring that he wanted both the protagonist and the tome. Reluctantly, the protagonist drew out the tome and extended it toward him. Farron praised the choice, saying it would settle all of his crimes. But as he reached for it, the protagonist's aura flared, and the tome began to burn. Farron shouted in disbelief, demanding to know what he was doing. The protagonist asked what it looked like, remarking that he had never promised to return it intact. Enraged, Farron swore that he would ensure his death would not come easily. But the protagonist cut him off, telling him simply to be silent and listen. The protagonist had never been in it for the money. Troubleshooting never paid well to begin with, and the only reason he had kept the tome was because it was tied to it. He asked Farin if he had ever heard of the troubleshooter devoured by Declan's young master. Farin stiffened, saying that such talk involved forbidden magic. The protagonist confirmed it, explaining that the young master had consumed his teammates, while the family covered everything up. When Farin demanded to know if this was about revenge, the protagonist replied that it was not so deep. He knew that the lives of troubleshooters were cheap, and his was no exception. Looking up at Farin, he admitted that he only wanted to make sure his fallen comrades received what they would have wanted, though that required a great deal of money. He added that he had already made up his mind to retire, and there was no chance he would crawl back into the kennel. Farin told him to consider those his last words. With a snap of his fingers, a blue aura erupted from him and wrapped around the protagonist. He explained that this was Declan's prized blue flame, a fire that never extinguished, and promised that the protagonist would burn within it, regretting his decision with every fiber of his being. The protagonist, however, declared that he would never regret it. As the flames consumed him, he said the only alternative was to return as their dog, and if he could not return to the gray zone, then death was not such a bad deal. Laughing in the face of death, he admitted he had never felt so free in his entire life. He lamented only that he would not escape alive, but vowed that if he were ever born again, he would seek freedom and take his revenge properly. As the fire reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The protagonist realized he was unharmed. Confused, he looked around and noticed that everything had frozen in place. At first, he wondered if he was losing his mind. Then he glanced at the tome still in his hand. As it floated upward, a golden magic array appeared on his chest. Bewildered, he demanded to know what was happening. When he next opened his eyes, he saw a coin drop into a bucket. Dazed, he questioned where he was, recalling that only moments before he had been burning to death. A creeping familiarity washed over him until he suddenly recognized the place. It was the gray zone, the place he had begged to return to every day before becoming a troubleshooter. In disbelief, he wondered if he had truly gone back in time. Later that day, he stood by a river, staring at his reflection. He confirmed it was still him, only younger. The one detail that carried over was the mark on his chest, a part of himself he despised. He concluded that somehow the tome had been responsible. Its importance had been so great that even the normally indolent head of House Declan had come in person to retrieve it. Though little was known of the relic, its power was undeniable. Ultimately, he decided not to question it. He would live the life he wanted, no matter what. The sensations were too vivid to dismiss as a dream. The foul stench of sewage from the lecture hall, the sharp bite of the air. He was alive, and not just alive, but placed in a position where anything he did might succeed. The only question left was what he truly wanted from this new life. He remembered that he once had a dream, one he had shared with his comrade. It was the same dream that had driven him to retire in the first place. As his comrade called out to him, the name finally slipped free: Aster. His companion reminded him that they had been born as vagrants in the gray zone, possessing nothing. They could not dress well, eat well, or even gain an education. He asked Aster what he thought had been the most painful part of it all. Aster casually replied that it was hunger. His comrade retorted that if it had only been hunger, their lives would never have fallen so low. He pressed Aster again, demanding to know what had dragged them down into the gutter. Aster, still half distracted, brushed it off, claiming he was fine while picking his nose. His comrade grew furious, and only then did Aster relent, agreeing to speak. He could not believe how intensely his friend was glaring at him. Astor's comrade told him that the most bitter thing in life had been their lack of education. If they had been able to study, he argued, they would not be living like this, enslaved by the powerful. He added that if he ever managed to retire, there was only one thing he wanted: to build a library. Astor raised an eyebrow, calling it a crazy dream. His comrade explained further. It would be a place where anyone, regardless of money, status, or gender, could freely read books. But that was only the beginning. He dreamed of building a tower, simply because he liked tall things. The location did not matter. He would write it all down in a book. But there was one volume that absolutely had to be there: Declan's Secret Manual. He wanted to place it at the very entrance, on the first floor, so even vagrants from the gray zone, illegitimate noble children, or butchers' sons could carry a copy. Its cover would bear the Declan crest, and inside would be the techniques that family treasured more than life itself. The very thought of spreading it far and wide made his mouth water. How he would get his hands on the manual, however, was a problem for his future self. For now, his plan was simple: to make Declan's most guarded secret public. Before he could speak another word, a boot struck him hard in the side of the head. As he toppled over, another figure snarled that he had been searching for him. He accused him of abandoning his seat and hiding out, asking if he had a death wish. The man began stomping him.
Astor reeled, wondering who this attacker was and why he was being ambushed. He reminded himself that he was a veteran troubleshooter, one who had survived countless battles. At last, he caught the man's foot, stunning his attacker with the realization that the boy was blocking him. Astor growled that he had been struck 7 times and would return the favor 70-fold. Raising his fist, he aimed for an uppercut, only to miss completely. Pain shot through him as his wrist cracked. Confused, Astor wondered what was wrong with his body and why a simple strike hurt so badly. His opponent retaliated, smashing a fist straight into his face and mocking him for daring to fight back, calling him crazy. Astor admitted that it hurt like hell, but what stung worse than the pain was the humiliation. Just then, the attacker tripped on a rock, stumbling backward into the filthy river. Seizing the opportunity, Astor declared that it was his chance and bolted. As his attacker choked on sewage, he shouted after Astor, demanding to know where he thought he was going. Astor retorted that this was not running away, but a tactical retreat, and vowed to remember his enemy's face. The blow he had landed would be worn like a medal on his chest, he claimed, as befitted a veteran troubleshooter, a man who did not know the meaning of surrender. Back in the alleys, however, his tone shifted. He admitted to himself that the situation was serious. His opponent had not been some frail clerk, yet he had sprained his wrist simply from throwing a punch. His body was far too weak. He concluded that before chasing dreams of towers and libraries, he needed to strengthen himself. As he walked, he suddenly heard a voice asking if he was hungry. Turning, he saw another boy watching him. Astor asked if the child knew who he was, but the boy shook his head. Astor muttered that he had expected as much. Looking closer, he realized the child was in tatters, yet his clothes were made from expensive fabric. He guessed he was a noble who had fallen from grace in some power struggle. In other words, a walking little bomb. Astor addressed him casually as Kid. The boy corrected him, saying his name was Damien. Astor nodded and said fine. Then Damien added that his mother's name was Bianca. Astor frowned, uneasy, feeling as though he were learning things he should not. He asked bluntly if the boy was not right in the head. Damien replied that he did not have a mother. Astor realized then that the child was genuinely slow and quickly apologized. He added that he himself had no father, so he won, and suggested they part ways. Astor tried his best not to get involved. A walking bomb like Damien was the last thing he needed, and he thought it wiser to ditch the boy before things became messy. Yet Damien remained rooted to the spot, staring at him. Astor finally asked why he wasn't leaving. Damien replied that he was going to follow him. For a moment, Astor debated simply hitting him to scare him off. Instead, he told the boy to get lost. Damien ignored him, pointing at his wrist and asking if it hurt. Before Aster could brush him off, the child stretched out his hand and began casting magic. To Aster's surprise, the pain in his wrists started to fade. Damien smiled and called it the magic touch, but Aster knew better. That was no simple trick. It was the light of healing, the secret family art of the Blander clan. Declan had destroyed Blander in his previous life, and his instincts as a troubleshooter screamed that he was stepping into something dangerous. Why, he wondered, was a Blander child wandering the gray zone when the family should still be thriving? He called Damien's name a few times, testing him, and noticed the boy's tone begin to shift. Then he saw it, two eyes of different colors staring back at him. His stomach sank as recognition struck. There had once been a member of the Blander bloodline with mismatched eyes. "Oh shit," Aster muttered under his breath. He remembered now. This was Damien von Blander, the so-called monster of Blander, the mad butcher who laughed while fighting and healed endlessly, a man said to be unkillable. Yet the child before him seemed slow, even harmless. Could this really be the same person? The memories returned vividly. In his past life, Aster and his comrades had been sent by Declan to the Blander estate, though they had never been told why. One comrade had whispered rumors of a monster that had already slaughtered dozens. Aster had assumed they mentioned ogre. Instead, he had witnessed something far worse. A human tearing through others with unnatural strength, sustaining himself with ceaseless healing magic, laughing like a madman. That was the moment Damien von Blander became infamous as the monster who would not die.
And yet here he was now, nothing more than a slow, awkward boy. Aster could not understand it. Why would the only son of the Blander head, a direct descendant of such a powerful family, be living in a shabby place like this? When Aster pressed him, Damien merely answered, "Food." Confused, Aster asked what he meant. Damien explained simply that his mother had always told him to eat well to stay healthy, and that Aster was sick because he never ate. Aster admitted the kid wasn't wrong. He then asked if Damien had any money. To his amazement, the boy pulled out an entire bucket full of coins. Without hesitation, Aster slung an arm around his shoulder and declared that they were now friends. Damien blinked, asking why. Aster insisted that friendship was simple. If one said they were friends, then they were, and friends shared what they had. He announced it was time to eat. Damien, guileless, fell headfirst into the friendship trap. As they ate together later, Damien asked Aster what he had to share. Aster replied dryly that the only thing he possessed was his friend. Damien nodded solemnly, saying that sounded tough. That night, after a heavy meal, Aster burped contentedly and felt refreshed from washing up. He noticed Damien peering curiously around the building. When asked what he was doing, Damien explained that he hadn't realized there was a house above the restaurant. They had always slept outside, and it was the first time he had noticed it. Aster chuckled at his innocence. Then Damien brought up something else. He said he didn't have a father either. Aster replied that he did, but Damien stubbornly insisted that he didn't. Aster could have hardly believed the boy was treating parentage like some sort of competition. Puzzled, Aster asked why Damien claimed earlier that he had no mother, despite giving her name. Damien looked around and answered simply that he didn't see her anywhere nearby. Aster groaned, holding his head in frustration. Determined to understand, he asked how long had Damien been alone. The boy said he had been on his own since running away from his family, and that he had slept 10 times since then. Aster frowned, asking if he meant 10 days. Damien clarified that he often napped twice in a day, so he wasn't sure. Since arriving in the gray zone, however, he hadn't napped at all. The ground was too uncomfortable. At that, Aster screamed into his pillow in exasperation. This kid was far too much. Still, he reasoned, while they were stuck together in the gray zone, acting as Damien's caretaker wouldn't be the worst idea.
Forming a connection with the Blander heir might prove useful later, especially when facing Declan. On top of that, prestigious families always had extensive libraries, which aligned neatly with his comrade's dream. But before anything else, Aster reminded himself of the grudges carved into his chest. There were 70 deaths waiting to be repaid. Aster told Damien that he was going to lie down and that the boy should not bother him. If he did, it would be a big problem. Damien asked if Aster was going to practice his breathing technique. Aster confirmed that he was, adding that when he was finished, Damien could practice too, and he would wait. Damien nodded, saying he understood. Taking a deep breath, Aster reflected on his past life. He had built his foundation in magic through the standard-issue spells given to troubleshooters, but their limits had been clear. That was why he had risked his life sneaking into noble houses to steal spells, nearly dying countless times in the process. Over the years, he had acquired techniques such as the heart and body methods used by knights, spirit magic, summoning, alchemy, and a variety of other arts. But right before his death, he had encountered a power of catastrophic scale, befitting the strongest mage in history. Now, he resolved, he would finally master Declan's foundation art, the heavenly origin technique, the root art of all Declan spells, capable of accommodating all types of mana. He had memorized it once for research, and now he had the opportunity to use it for real. As he began the breathing exercise, the golden magic circle on his chest flared with intense heat. Aster felt it like molten lava coursing through his body. He told himself to focus, assuring himself that he could endure it. Looking down, he was shocked to see impurity seeping out of his hands. He asked why they were there. This purification process, he realized, was a high-level technique used only by elite mages, noble families, or direct bloodlines. It forced mana to burn through impurities blocking the circuits, a process often called a mana shower. Aster gasped as he felt every impurity being incinerated from his body. When he finally opened his eyes, he was back in reality. He checked the time and saw Damien knocked out nearby. More importantly, he realized that his mana circuits were completely purified, better than in his past life. Even so, he admitted he still wasn't sure if it would be enough to defeat Farron. Even if he were reborn 100 times, victory might be impossible. But one thing was certain, his chances had increased, and he had never given up, even when the odds were nearly zero. The next day, Damien was thrilled to see that his hair was now brown. Aster explained that he had covered his platinum-colored hair and changed clothes so the Blander family would not notice them. For now, the only thing left to do was head out. Damien, calling him a friend, asked, "What are we going to do next?" Aster smiled and said they were going to cause some chaos. They soon ran into a figure in an alley. The man commented that it was a good nap and the weather was nice, then noticed Aster. He asked what the youngest was doing there, where he had been running off to, and joked how clean he looked. Did he shower in the sewer? Then he spotted Damien and commented that the boy looked rich. In response, Aster delivered a precise hit to his stomach, saying it seemed he had found the right place to return the hits owed to him. Others began rushing out of the building, asking what was happening. They recognized Aster as the youngest and surrounded him instantly. Aster observed they were all familiar faces. It was a scary situation, but he knew it would be even scarier for them. He moved with precision, hitting one man squarely in the face and another in the gut. He relished every moment. Damien watched, amazed, as Aster pummeled the crowd. Aster was using mana, clenching his fists tightly and striking repeatedly with incredible force. He encouraged Damien to acknowledge how awesome it was, letting him admire him. One of the men fell in front of Damien, injured. Damien immediately healed him. The man thanked him, and Astor seized the opportunity, declaring that now he could continue beating them without worrying about killing anyone. For hours the attackers screamed, writhing on the ground, their shouts echoing through the alley. Astor even swung a weapon, delivering punishment to the man who had beaten him by the river. He asked how many times he had been hit. The man admitted he couldn't remember. Astor handed him over to Damien, who asked if it was his turn. It turned out they were alternating between healing and beating, over and over. The man protested that it needed to stop. Astor, calm and precise, instructed him to listen carefully one more time. Everything that was happening was his own fault. Meanwhile, Damien enthusiastically continued to heal and pummel the man. The man finally admitted defeat, unable to count how many times he had been hit. Later that night, Astor thanked them all for today, and they thanked him back. Astor said the energy was well placed, and he felt pretty proud, while Damien just wanted to play again later, as if sleep was some optional side quest. Astor was also proud of himself for completing over 100 hits per person, totaling over 1,000. This was a new challenge even for him, and he once more muttered, "Easy for a veteran troubleshooter who's fought every battle except mountain and aerial combat." At this point, it had become a running gag. The guy from earlier then called out, asking if they could go now. They'd had enough. Astor agreed, and the guy added that this was actually his house. Astor raised an eyebrow. "So you're telling us to get lost? That's, ambitious." "No," he replied. "You'll be the ones leaving." Astor shook his head. "Not resentment, huh? Still, yeah, that's difficult." As they waved off their new best friends, Astor sensed someone coming straight toward them, fast, secretive, and unmistakably a troubleshooter-type presence. Probably after Damien. He was careful in his own way. Astor wondered how they'd found him, and seriously, the Blander came first?
If the mana was this strong, even a single magic spell would be tough. Hand-to-hand combat? Forget it. Not good. But, well, take a shot every time. He reminded himself he was a veteran troubleshooter. Situations like this weren't unfamiliar. He started gathering mana at his fingertips again using the spirit gun, compressing it repeatedly until satisfied. The jacket on his back flared dramatically in the wind, because of course it did, just as he turned and aimed downward. This is my only chance, he thought, seeing the pursuer directly in front of them. The guy dropped to his knees, catching Astor off guard. He slid forward in a rock and roll motion, screaming, "I'm so glad to see my young master!" "Alfred!" Damien yelled. Astor internally groaned. I was just about to make a Batman joke, and now it's Alfredo, of course. Alfredo said he didn't know how long they'd been searching or what Damien had been up to, lamenting that he hadn't slept a wink because of worry. Damien told him to get off, and Alfredo said he wouldn't. He wouldn't let go until Damien returned to the family, or they could kill him instead. Astor just cringed. Alfredo apologized for the fuss in front of a guest and introduced himself formally as the Blander family's butler. Astor introduced himself as well, keeping it polite. Then Alfredo explained that the young master liked Astor very much and asked if he could accompany them to the family estate. Astor thought it over. The Blanders were prestigious, with a rule to avoid anything dirty and avoid anything overly noble. He couldn't figure out their true intentions, but it didn't matter. He planned to form a connection anyway. Conveniently, their estate was on a path leading to the city. Xenian Academy, said to be the best in the East, also boasted the best library. Astor was building the best library in the world, so skipping this would be like ignoring a side quest labeled Guaranteed Loot. "I understand," he said, thanking Alfredo. The butler said he'd fetch the carriage and asked him to wait. Astor admitted he had strayed a little from the path, but in this case, straying seemed beneficial. And, he thought, it was time to see if the Blander family's food lived up to the hype. They headed out that night and arrived at the estate. Alfredo welcomed Astor to the Blander family. Astor hopped off the whip and said this would be his first official visit to the Blander family's mansion.
Alfredo reminded him that it was late and they should rest, then called over one of the maids, Lansansi, saying he was counting on her. Lansansi immediately scolded Damien, ordering him to follow her. Damien laughed nervously as he ran, shouting, "I'm so glad to see my young master." Because, of course, apparently confessing while fleeing was mandatory. Further into the estate, Alfredo walked down the hallways until he reached a door. He knocked, and a woman's voice told him to enter. Once inside, she asked about Damien. Alfredo explained that Damien had been in the 7th black and white zone and was on his way after he brought him home. For a second, he stood there, only for the woman to explode something on her desk, a magic circle forming as she demanded what the hell was he doing there? Is Damien okay? Surely nothing has happened to him. Because, of course, any hint of trouble for her son would cause her to lose her mind. Alfredo calmly told her to relax and hear him out. She sat down, undoing the magic circle, sighing of relief. Alfredo added, "It's fortunate for you and fortunate for anyone who might have tried to harm the young master. The fury of a mother once called the blood which knows no bounds leaves nobody standing. If it's about his son, well, let's just say it's better it ended like this." She acknowledged his efforts. He worked hard. Alfredo waved it off. "Don't mention it. It was my duty." Then he added, "But there is one unusual thing to mention." "Unusual?" she asked. "It's about the friend he made. Aster noticed his presence before the friend even appeared. He was already prepared for a counterattack. And when they faced each other, what was in the boy's hand was a mono bullet." "That's certainly astonishing," she said. "A child with that talent shouldn't be in the gray zone." "Exactly," Alfredo said, "which is why I have a favor to ask." The next day, Alfredo confidently asked Aster to become his successor. Aster blinked. "What the hell are you talking about?" Alfredo just smiled. He was confident Aster wouldn't refuse. After all, a butler of a prestigious family offering a stray from the slums a high-income opportunity was basically irresistible. Aster said no. Alfredo froze. "Why the hell not? Are you seriously refusing to become my successor?" Damien piped up, asking what this meant.